Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider Indianapolis Star. He's Mike Niziolek, Bloomington Herald Times. This is Mind Your Banners for January 11th, 2024. This is one of the more exciting days of the new year for me, Mike, because I get to declare it's mid-January, which means we're all the closer to late January, which means we're closer to the end of January, which is hands down the worst month of all the months of the year.
Isn't it January 11th? Why, how is that mid-January? Wouldn't the
Because the,
15th
the,
be
the, the first
mid-January?
10 days are early January, the second 10 days are mid-January, and then the last 11 days will just allow for me in late January.
Interesting. I think February is the worst month.
See, my birthday's in February, so I can't say that.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah,
yeah.
like I have something to sort of pick me up. Also, February is better than January because it's shorter. So it's both my birth month, which means presents, obviously, because I'm a 12-year-old, and also it just doesn't last as long. You get to
No,
you
I
get
get
to late
birthdays. Yeah,
February,
no,
late earlier
bir-
than you get to late January. Think about that.
birthday elevates it. You can't. Yeah,
I
I
share a
get
birthday with Hank Aaron and Cristiano Ronaldo. So
that's
people
interesting.
ask what happened to them. Anyway, we're here to talk about IU basketball, men's and women's. I think we're going to get into the women's team a little bit later. 5-0 in the Big Ten. 5-0, 5-0, right? So
Record start in the
obviously,
Big Ten.
obviously, still just kind of steaming along. I think in particular, um, in the Big Ten conference, that is quietly opening up for one or two teams. The other one being a team they're going to face very soon. Obviously, is what's become, as even Teri Moren acknowledged, something of a rivalry with Iowa. Talk about the men's team first. I think since the last time we talked, they've gone 1-1. They had what I thought was actually a relatively impressive home win against Ohio State that obviously hasn't aged as well since Ohio State lost to Wisconsin. There is something to be said for the fact that Indiana seems to just be ruining the Big Ten teams that it beats. And then a frustrating loss at Rutgers for Indiana. I think in particular because unlike last year when Indiana went to Rutgers and frankly just kind of no showed, this game was winnable in some very sort of tangible ways, and Indiana kind of didn't pull it together. I think it's fair to say, for the moment anyway, Indiana just still just kind of feels like a team that is just struggling to kind of um, pull together the sort of consistency that it needs to sort of meet this challenge Mike Woodson keeps talking about playing the same way on the road that you do at home and limiting the mistakes that allow you to get home, big wins on the road and those kinds of things. It's kind of beyond Indiana at the moment.
Well, I mean, I know it's been a couple days. Let's talk about a couple things. I wanted to get your since we haven't had a chance to talk. I don't think at all. I don't even know your opinions off air. Uh, uh, Xavier Johnson gets kicked out of the game for the low blow. Mike Woodson called it a fiasco. I would have loved to ask if we didn't get a chance to follow up with that. Did he, is the fiasco the call or was the fiasco Xavier Johnson going low? What would you define? What does Zach Osterman think what the fiasco was? And I mean,
Yeah.
he had bad body language too, I thought, in the game. He looked very frustrated at Xavier coming off a game where he said, I need to be more mature. I need to make the right decisions. And that sort of gave them one less guy, I think, on the court to when they needed it late in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, I
Or,
mean,
sorry, second quarters covered the women's game last night.
yeah, no, I mean, it's kind of, first of all, I think it is, anyone can confidently say Xavier Johnson should not have done what he did. And I think replay bared that out. And, um, I think
He took a
it's,
pretty good hit for it. He took a pretty good hit for it.
yeah, the only thing I was a little bit surprised by
That he
was,
didn't get like a after like a flag on the play, like two flags.
yeah, basically, I mean, I'm not sure they should have both been flagrants, but I mean, Antoine, again, replay tells you why it happened, but Antoine Woolfolk took a pretty good shot at his neck.
He did.
And if you notice on the replay, Xavier Johnson like waved to him, like basically, I think thought that he
Yes.
had he
Yes.
had baited
Yes.
Woolfolk into a flagrant one or a flagrant two. Um, I think that ultimately the most disappointing thing, if you're Indiana, is probably just I mean, Xavier Johnson himself like said Saturday night, "Oh, I've got growing up to do. I'm always growing up. I'm still growing up." And then
Yeah.
this happens on Tuesday, and I thought it was, I mean, Xavier Johnson's maybe the most extreme example of it, but I also thought, and this is what I wrote about, I thought it was telling. Mike Woodson basically called his seniors out by name after the game. And he literally said, I got one
Not
senior,
Anthony Leal.
no problems. Anthony Leal giving me everything I need. I got three other seniors just not holding up their end right now.
Anthony,
Yeah.
Trey.
No, I mean he was just like
Make sure
Anthony
that
Walker,
they
Trey
get.
Galloway. And again, Xavier Johnson is on Tuesday night the most extreme or obvious or apparent example of that. But like it was just interesting to me that Woodson was sort of willing to just say, and I think, listen, I think the thing is, like, last year Indiana went to Rutgers and they lost by 15. They did not play well at all. Xavier Johnson is exactly the sort of player that tends to struggle against a team like Rutgers that is really good with ball pressure. They did that same matchup zone a year ago. If you go back to that game, I mean, Jalen Hinchafino was out for that game. I think it was his back. That was when he missed like 3 games in a row for some sort of back issue, or 2 games in a row, whatever it was. Xavier Johnson was 2 of 11 from the floor. Trace Jackson Davis only had 13 points. I mean, Rutgers just like the 2 lowest points per possession numbers of the Mike Woodson era per KenPom both came against Rutgers. But that game was just sort of like, okay, Indiana just played bad everywhere. And they weren't, that was a better Rutgers team. Indiana was not ready for that matchup zone. They just, other than it, like it would have been even more ugly if Miller Kopp hadn't hit a bunch of threes. And so he kind of walked out and just said, hey, it was just a bad day at the office. I think they'd had travel problems, which they had again this trip. Every time they go to New Jersey, something seems to happen. They didn't leave until Wednesday morning because of the storms. And it was just sort of like, hey, that was just a bad day. The thing about this game is it was winnable.
Yeah.
They only lost by 9. They missed 11 free throws. Rutgers didn't make a field goal in the last 4 minutes and 40 seconds of the game.
That one was an amazing stat to me. That they
yeah. The 3-point shooting number is a little bit exaggerated because they were kind of just cranking them up late in the game, trying to chase the scoreboard. But you make even, I don't know, 6 of those free throws. That's not even a very good free throw shooting number. That's 67%. You make 6 of those free throws and make 1 more 3, and it's a tie game. And it's a tie game against a Rutgers team that's not very good, that's still at the time winless in conference play, that doesn't really have kind of a go-to scorer. And so suddenly you kind of be in control. And I think Mike Woodson's frustration is a little bit more that he sees a game like this and he just thinks that was winnable. And again, Johnson is the most extreme example of this, but Anthony Walker plays 6 minutes. He's got 3 rebounds, 2 turnovers. He doesn't score. Trey Galloway plays 34 minutes. He's got 8 points. He's got 5 assists. He's got 3 steals, but he's also 4 of 13 from the floor, and he misses both of his free throws. He's only got 2 rebounds. I think it's just a game where Mike Woodson would look at his more experienced players and he'd say, this is where I need you.
And he's talked about
and I got some grief for saying Indiana's a young team on Twitter, but like they're 221st according to Ken Pomeroy in Division I experience. And there's a lot of, they start 2 guys that are in their combined 10th year of college in the backcourt. Fine. But literally everything else around them is either guys that are young or guys that haven't played much together or both. And I think it's Mike Woodson saying, I just can't afford for you guys to just no-show me like this when I've got,
they've got to essentially be
everywhere else.
His presence on the floor. Like he says, like, I've got to get this team where it needs to be. And like, he can't play. So the seniors have to be the guys that sort of anchor what his message is, what the effort, the focus, and we haven't talked about kind of the turnovers that, at least 17 turnovers in 3 last 4 games. That's a terrible stretch. And, when things have gone wrong, he's been very critical of the guards. Now he's expanded it to the seniors because Anthony Walker hasn't played well last 2 games, wasn't used much in the last one. But I think that stands out that, he's looking for, like, he's trying to coach up these young guys. He can't be worried about the players that he should have to invest the least amount of time in to sort of with effort and with making smart decisions. Like, that's wasted time in his mind. I feel like that he can't be doing this at this point with Xavier Johnson and Trey Galloway. They need to be better so he can worry about like you said, I would define this as a very young team, an inexperienced team, even though they have a starting backcourt that has experience. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was the substitutions of it all, that drew some reactions. That Mike Woodson was sort of dismissive of the question. I viewed it as the reserves didn't lose that game. I thought the starters played pretty poorly down the stretch, and
Yeah,
it didn't really have an impact in the game at all. Like, yeah, they gave up a 7-point lead in like the first 7 minutes, but like,
I
what do you
wrote
think?
I wrote about this in my talking points newsletter today. Like I don't like like uh, when a team loses or struggles, like rotations and bench lineups and like that stuff is always kind of like an easy sort of like complaint because listen,
But like the bench didn't play. Like, I mean, it would
and
be.
the reason
They
your
weren't
bench
on the floor in
doesn't
the
look as
second
good as your
half,
starters at times is because your bench players aren't as good as your starters, otherwise they'd start.
but they
um
weren't even on the floor to really do anything in the second.
no,
Like,
and they're like if you go back on the play-by-play, Indiana actually basically like the crest of Indiana's wave was 20-13 in the first half. They had an 18-12 lead and then a 20-13 lead. And when they had the 20-13 lead, and I'll go into my story so I just get this right. When they had the 20-13 lead, um, I'm looking for it as we speak on air admin. When they had the 20-13 lead, 4 starters were on the bench. I think the only one that was on the floor was either kel'el or Xavier Johnson, one of the two that he Woodson had started to roll back through. Um, I don't think the complaints about Woodson's rotation are quite on point. The complaints about consistency of your bench are fair. I mean,
yeah, but
like
I mean
Anthony
that wasn't the.
Walker
Yeah, I didn't think that was the question.
is
Was more about how he's playing them, not how they're playing. It was more. It was very specifically about the rotations and why do you play 4 bench players at once and not mix and match a little more. But he had played his starters more minutes against Ohio State than he had all season, especially in the first half. I just found it the premise I thought was flawed in a game where the starters lost the game to
if
me.
well, I mean, and I'd have to go back through I'll get the the box score up while we're talking. I think one thing more broadly that has stood out to me is actually quietly, like, first of all, Mike Woodson can't not play his bench. Like, you can't just play your starters 38 minutes a night. That's obviously not practical.
And that's what his
Um,
point was, and it has been throughout the season when he's been asked about it. But
the the pattern that we have seen across his 3 seasons or 2.5 seasons or however you want to define it, the pattern that we have generally seen from Woodson has been that near the beginning of the season, he plays a pretty defined second line. And he does that, I think, both to tinker with rotations and also just to try and keep minutes out of guys' legs where he can. And inevitably, invariably, there will be games where that second line goes in and Indiana's beating, Morehead State by 19, and the second line goes in and it's not as good as the first line, and suddenly Morehead State's down 11, and Indiana starts rolling its starters back out on the floor, and everybody says, well, what was that bench lineup? What was he doing? Well, what he was doing was giving his starters rest. His bench players are not as consistent. They're probably not as experienced. There's a reason they're playing off the bench. They struggle a little bit more. They also don't play as many minutes. Like, it's worth saying, the more minutes you play on the floor together, the better you're probably going to be together. Bench players aren't getting that the way starters are. And so, in general, you're just gonna, like, it is inevitable that you're gonna have some of this. And it is worth saying, if you look at the plus minus, on Tuesday, Indiana's bench is plus minus. Gabe Cupps was -9, Anthony Leo was -7, Anthony Walker was -10. Those are your top 3 plus minus, like in the red, if you want to say. And if you look at evanmaya.com, Evan Mayakawa's site, Indiana's bench players are pretty much all in the red, and its starters are all in the black, and the season long plus minus. Now, bear in mind, that's still taking into account non-conference play. But the flip side to that is, like, he only played 6 players more than 6 minutes at
right.
Rutgers, Mike Woodson. He only played, I think it was, what was it? He only played,
Like Peyton Sparks was in for a hot minute. Did Anthony Leo play
he only
against?
played 8. He essentially only played 8 players against Ohio State. Gabe Cupps played 4 minutes. Anthony Walker got 12, Caleb Banks got 13, CJ Gunn got 24. Like if we just kind of keep cycling backward, he has started, I would argue, he has started trimming his bench
Yeah, I agree.
a
Winnowing.
lot sooner than he normally does. Because you go back 2 years, and I mentioned this in talking points. He played basically 8 players against Illinois in the Big Ten tournament game that they won against Illinois that effectively got them in the NCAA tournament. He essentially just played 7 players against Iowa the next day. By the end of last season, Indiana was pretty much down to a 7-man rotation. Caleb Banks would get scattered in here and there, but it was pretty much just the starters plus Malik Renew and Tamar Bates, and that was it.
And I
My
think that's
point
where
is,
he's kind of going. I mean, he's trying to figure out if it's Gunn, Banks, or Walker who should get the bulk of the minutes. And Gunn's gotten the last 2 games. I think he's trying to piece that together, and that's kind of where he's going. The direction.
and generally speaking, I think that he's usually, like, I would argue that statistically speaking, or whatever you want to say, he has probably pared down his rotation more now at this point in the calendar than is normal for him. That like if you, I mean, like I'm just going back through box scores. You know, he played 10 players against Wisconsin last year. Now that was a blowout win, but you know, 9 of them got at least, no, he played 11 players. 9 of them got at least 5 minutes. You know, he really didn't get to a point where he had cut his bench down to basically 2 until probably mid-late February. I think he's actually already at that point now. More like he's you know, Peyton Sparks really isn't playing much right now. Anthony Leal's coming in here and there, but it's you know, it's him trying to figure out almost like 3 from 4 of Cups, Gunn, Banks, and Walker. He doesn't tend to play all 4 of them that many minutes. And I'm with you. Like, if you actually just look at the play-by-play, like, yes, Indiana struggled at times with some of its bench players on the floor, but guess what? Indiana basically played well for about 10 minutes on Tuesday and then didn't play well for 30 minutes. Everyone was kind of involved in that. I just,
and
like,
I think
the
it's
complaint
more.
you have is just that individual players are struggling. Like Caleb Banks and Peyton Sparks foul too much. CJ Gunn has only just now started finding his jumper, although to be fair, he's 6 of 12 in Big Ten play. Anthony Walker's got 1 point in his last 2 games, and he's supposed to be the guy that was like your most consistent. Like, your complaints are about the performance of individual bench players. I don't think the bench lineups and the way Mike Woodson rolls through his rotation are the problem are a problem at the scope that people are making it out to be.
Well, and I think it's more of it's sort of, you have to go backwards. That's more, I think, what people are actually upset about is the roster construction. And, you know, the bench is not playing well, but just the idea that they don't have any shooters. So the guys that they have coming off the bench are not fulfilling the roles that they sort of like would need or would complement a Kel'el Ware and a Malik Renew. And I think that it sort of exacerbates the problem. And I mean, you know, since you can't really change your roster at this point in the year, you're kind of stuck complaining about the things that you know, that you could try to change. But you know, like I said, I don't think it's contributing to didn't contribute to their loss against Rutgers, in my mind. I mean, Xavier Johnson's getting kicked out was more of it, obviously, a factor, and forcing Woodson to go away from an experienced 6-year senior than anything sort of his rotations in the first half, which, you know, like you said, he's winnowing it down now. So I can understand his sort of, I mean, he didn't answer the question with much elegance, but I mean, he's very to the point and blunt. And so I think fans' sort of frustration with that part of it is overblown. I mean, losing to Rutgers, I mean, that Rutgers team was atrocious offensively. I mean, I think that was enough. You could just be frustrated with that. I mean, that was a bad offensive team.
In the second half, he played Gabe Cupps, Anthony Leal, and Anthony Walker a combined 7 minutes. And Caleb Banks and Peyton Sparks both appear in the second half box score. Banks is -1 with nothing else on his ledger, and 0 minutes. So he was on the floor for less than a minute. Sparks has nothing but zeros. My point, and I'm not picking on these players so much as just saying, like, you know, second half, even after Xavier Johnson goes down, Xavier Johnson only plays 7 minutes in the second half. Even with that, he effectively played 6 players across the entire. And that's the other thing he tends to do is He tends to do more of kind of a full bench rotation, whatever his bench is at that given time in the first half,
Yeah.
and then lean more heavily into either the starters or if like we saw this against Ohio State. If CJ Gunn's shooting the ball well, playing well defensively, whatever, he'll stick with it. We saw that against Michigan too. But he tends to lean into the guys that he feels are playing well more in the second half. And if you look at it, kel'el Ware, 18 minutes in the second half, Malik Renew, 20 minutes in the second half, Mackenzie Mbaka, 16, Trey Galloway, 17. He basically didn't take his starters off the floor. So, I mean, I think you're right that like the greater complaints are roster construction. And like, I think that if CJ Gunn continues to shoot the ball well coming off the bench, then I think suddenly people's opinions of the bench change a little bit because they feel like there's actually because I think what's frustrating for people is they feel like there's not necessarily a positive change off the bench right now. Like that there's, and I
It's
would
just
argue
holding, it's their placeholder to not lose a lead. As
yeah,
opposed
and
to
like I would argue at times that's not been the case. Anthony Walker's had some good games.
No, but I just think that's the perception of this bench right now, that they're
Yes.
that the best that they can do is just not give up points.
This bench is magnifying like the wider issues of
Correct.
sort of roster construction and some guys don't. And like the other thing is, if you're a head coach, you're always walking this line where you can sort of justifiably say, well, if I don't play these guys, they're never going to get better. And if they don't get better, then I'm never going to have a bench. So, I sort of understand a little bit of that too, which is like you're trying to find ways, opportunities for these guys to improve. But no, it is a problem. And I think that, I mean, listen, the flip side is, and we've talked a lot about Rutgers here, I do think it's worth talking about the Ohio State game too. Indiana doesn't win that game without CJ Gunn, who comes in, makes some big shots, plays really well down the stretch. I thought his offense and his defense fed one another. Again, that's a game where it's effectively an 8-man bench, and really in that second half, it's largely a 6-man rotation. But I thought Indiana played really well, particularly given how badly they got beat up on the boards. Ohio State finished 52.4% offensive rebound rate. That's a staggering number. And yet Indiana was in control of that game a lot down the stretch because Indiana made key shots. Indiana got some big stops, and Mike Woodson will probably highlight this in red, only 4 turnovers in that game.
Yeah, but I mean, that's proving to be the outlier with the turnovers versus the other games where they've been horrible. When you now look at sort of what they have coming up, we got Minnesota on Friday, Purdue next week, and then that 3-game stretch with Purdue, Wisconsin, Illinois, 2 of those on the road. What are you expecting? I mean, do you have a read on this team at all?
No, I mean, right now I think this team wins at home because home is comfortable and struggles to lose on the road, or struggles to win on the road because the road is not comfortable. I think this team is actually quietly in a place where these next 2 games are actually kind of must wins.
You've said that now about the last 2 as well. So we are
Well,
going.
I know I said I didn't want to say they were must wins. I actually think these kind of are. Like you've got to be good enough to beat Minnesota at home.
But what's their? Because I mean, is their path to the tournament like they have to win? Because they have to win all their home games, right?
Well, add it up. If they beat Minnesota, Purdue, Iowa, Penn State, Northwestern, Nebraska, Wisconsin, that's what 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 more home games. That would get them to 19 wins. If we go to the net rankings, where are we at here? Where's Wisconsin would be a quad 1 win. Purdue would be a quad 1 win. That's not a ton, but that's at least something. Michigan State today would be a quad 1 win. So you'd at least get 3 quad 1s there, and you get to 19 games. And then if you could just find a way to if you actually did this and you beat, let's say, Penn State, Minnesota, and Northwestern on the road, that would give you 1 more quad 1, and you'd have 22 wins.
They have Northwestern at home.
I thought they played Northwestern on the road too. No, they don't. Okay, so then, yeah, then your problem if you're Indiana is going to be like it's very hard to see them doing anything meaningful away from home. I guess Ohio State is probably their best because Penn State won't do much for you. I don't think Minnesota's not a quad one win as of right now. So those would not be quality road wins. Maryland, I would be shocked if I haven't been in the net rankings, and Maryland is nowhere near being quad one. Obviously, Michigan's probably not going to be quad one. That season is kind of turned into a mess.
Did you see
I
that they
just
suspended a guy for only road games?
Well, yeah, it's because of academic. He's going to dress at home, but is he going to play?
That's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. That
Yeah.
was an aside. But so
Uh,
I mean that's a really tough road, tough need. I mean, because you got Purdue at home, that's gonna be hard. Wisconsin at home, Michigan State, those are not cakewalks. And I
no.
mean, they're not playing well enough to really say, oh yeah, they're gonna that's gonna be possible. They're just the Rutgers loss is really gonna loom large on the schedule, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, I just think generally, like I don't know if there's one loss that looms to me more than others. Maybe Kansas, I guess, because that felt gettable. That felt like a bit of a season defining, turn if they could have won it. Um, I mean, like, I don't think they can, for obvious reasons. I don't think they can reliably just stand here and say, "Oh, well, we'll win out at home." But I guess my point about the next two is you have to be able to beat Minnesota at home. If you can't beat Minnesota at home, then it's not practical to think you're going to beat Penn State at home, Northwestern at home. Nebraska's a lot better than we expected, but Nebraska at home, like you've got to at least prove you can beat that caliber of team or any team in that area. And it's worth saying, like, as good as Nebraska's looked, they did lose to Minnesota, so give Minnesota some respect there. Um, you've got to prove you can win the games at home that just generally you can't really afford to lose just from a quantity perspective. And then I think you've got to beat Purdue just to prove you can beat a team of that level because they've got to do it. And listen, we have this conversation every year. There are a bunch of teams with you know, unimpressive resumes in the NCAA tournament. Like that's why the bubble, like every year we're like, the bubble's weak this year. And it's like, no, the bubble's
Yeah.
just the bubble. Like the bubble is just full of teams that are on the bubble because they haven't done enough to convince you. But you got to prove at some point you can beat a team of that caliber. And you've certainly got to do it, by the end of the season, but I think you've got to do it soon because you don't want to get into a situation where Wisconsin's coming into town on February 27th and you feel like the season's over if you don't win that game. And so I think they've got to prove they can get those kinds of wins soon.
Well, with a team like that we've talked about that we feel is inexperienced, that I think is inexperienced, confidence becomes an issue, I think, at some point too. Does it start to wane? These road games, does it spill over at some point? Because you're going to have multiple stretches here in the back half of the season where you're playing multiple road games back to back, back to back road games. And then is your confidence shot? If you lose to Wisconsin, Illinois, and things aren't looking pretty, what happens against Iowa? Or the same thing, Ohio State and Purdue. Does Northwestern come and steal one from you? And I'm interested that the psyche of this team has sort of been up and down. They've responded at times. At other times when you think they're going to kind of take a step forward, like I thought the Ohio State win we've talked about kind of was their best maybe win of the season, and then they just lay an egg at Rutgers. So you said that's a tough place they played historically, but that still was a bad Rutgers team.
It was. I mean, the issue with Rutgers is it's Mike Woodson does not seem to have solved facing a team that can just muck it up defensively the way Rutgers can. And like it's weird because he kind of hasn't solved the extremes. He's only beaten Rutgers once, and he's never beaten Iowa. So it's like he hasn't really figured out like how to manage the extremes of teams that don't play any defense but can shoot the lights out of the gym, and teams that look like they're setting basketball back 30 years offensively but can do so much defensively to just take you out of what you want to do, and can do so much in terms of like defending physically without fouling and all those different kinds of things. Those seem to be like the outliers are the ones you struggle with the most. So
yeah, I don't even. But that's not that crowd. I mean, there was nobody there because it was a emergency. I mean, you couldn't even get there. Like, I mean, they shouldn't have been intimidated by that environment.
Minnesota Friday night, Purdue Tuesday. I think it's going to be a big. I mean, it feels like it's going to be a big 5 days for Indiana to just see if it can kind of get a hold of the direction of its season. Let's talk about the women. 14-1. as we mentioned earlier, 5-0 in the Big Ten, 9-0 in general. The only loss this season, obviously, was a bit of a staggerer in terms of the final score, but losing at Stanford is a perfectly like reasonable thing to do, especially in early mid-November. They're shooting 39% in the season on threes. I mean, they are just, and they're taking a bunch of them. Like if you look at kind of, I'm looking at the top 10 teams nationally and shooting threes. They've taken, I think, the fourth most of the top 10 teams, or fourth or fifth most of the top 10 teams in the country in terms of 3-point attempts, and they're shooting 39%, which is seventh nationally. We saw this a little bit last year too. But when you can do it with Yard and Guard Zone, you can obviously do it with Sarah Scalia, you can do it with Sydney Parrish, Chloe Moore-McNeil. Like when you have all these different players that on any given night can hit 3, 4, even 5 of them, and then you have an elite post player, it is a really basic formula that a lot of opponents are going to struggle to manage.
Well, they had one stretch where they had a different 30-point score leading the team in 3 different games, and so it kind of highlights what their starting lineup is able to do, how dynamic offensively they are. I think kind of the key for this team is defensively to sort of live up to the expectations Teri Moren set. They haven't thus far this season. She's harped on it every game, even though they've won some of those non-conference games about 50 points. She was on them about sort of having more focus, having more intensity. You saw that in a little bit, glimpses of it last night's win. They had to come back from 9 points against Penn State in the second half. And I thought that was sort of, showing some championship mettle. Teri compared it to the game they had. They lost in the tournament to Miami a year ago, where they just got jumped on out the front and couldn't get back in it. They flipped the script yesterday and came back. Offensively, it was a bit of a slog, but they didn't have a very good shooting night, but they showed they could still beat a team. And I thought that was sort of a key moment for them. They've won 13 straight now, 2 away from tying the program record. And then, obviously the big one, they have to go through Iowa on Saturday to make that happen. And the Caitlin Clark show that, expected sell out 15,000 plus for, I got a story running tomorrow just about how consequential, not only in the Big Ten, but nationally, this rivalry, this series of games has become. I mean, it's sort of a pivotal game in women's college hoops. Not just this conference, not just this year. Last couple of years has been kind of the game or series.
I think quickly, and then I do want to close with Iowa, but it's also stood out to me that Indiana's got some real depth this season. I mean, there were times last year where, it felt like Indiana was just kind of running, a rotation that went 6 deep, and Teri Moren would kind of fire off these quick, Lexus Bargesser or Lady Meester would go in for like 2 minutes and then run back out, and Mackenzie Holmes would run back in or whatever. But I mean, you've got 4 bench players playing at least 10 minutes a game, and I imagine that will probably tighten up in some respects as you get deeper into Big Ten play, again talking about rotations. But I think that also makes a difference, especially when you've got some players there, not least Mackenzie Holmes, who played a lot of basketball, and by the end of last season, Mackenzie Holmes' sort of health and the wear and tear was a big discussion. I think the quality of Indiana's bench sort of minutes is also, I don't know, it's I think it's made a difference for this team so far, but I think it's going to make perhaps an even bigger difference as we get deeper into the season, because again, there was, fair or not, this perception that Indiana was kind of worn down by the end of last year.
Well, yeah, and the focus has been Holmes specifically, that she needs to be more comfortable coming out and not, fighting tooth and nail to stay on the floor. She needs to have trust that she can get those spells early in the games and be more, fresh, not just in late in games, but late in the season, like you said, because that knee was, a problem last year.
It is the Caitlin Clark show Saturday. You'll be there. I mean, it does sort of feel, with respect to the rest of the conference, like these two programs have separated themselves. Obviously, Indiana got the better of Iowa in the Big Ten regular season last year. Iowa, of course, had the more successful postseason. I mean, I liked that Terry Moren just kind of said it's become a bit of a rivalry. You get coaches a lot of times who play this stuff down. They say, "Oh, it's not this and it's not that." And obviously, Indiana Iowa will never be a traditional rivalry in the way Indiana Purdue or Indiana Kentucky, something like that. But I like that it seems like this program is embracing kind of the idea that you know Mackenzie Holmes Indiana versus Caitlin Clark's Iowa is kind of the defining sort of matchup of this particular sort of period in the history of Big Ten women's basketball. And Saturday night is going to be a fascinating test for this team.
Well, yeah, and the games haven't disappointed. 6 of the last 7 single-digit games. The last 3 have been, one possession games within 8 minutes in the fourth quarter. Obviously, the last one was one that I talked to Mackenzie this week. That shot that Caitlin hit, the buzzer beater, is kind of in the regular season finale. Has stuck with this team. They watched her kind of, go into the crowd with her teammates, and they had kind of deja vu when they saw her do that against Michigan State. That one was from half court, and just so this team, their big thing, and what Teri preaches, next game on the schedule. That's all we think about, but you have to think in the back of their minds they know what this means and how important this one is.
And the one thing that interests me is I think since December 10th, Iowa's played basically one close game. And
They
that
are
was
also on a 13-game win streak. And
yeah, that was the Michigan State game where Caitlin Clark hit the buzzer beater, and I don't remember if there was some controversy about the end of that game or not, but they have been just kind of steamrolling most teams they've played. They beat Minnesota by 23. You go back to the December Big Ten start, they beat Wisconsin by 22. They beat Rutgers by 34. They just beat Purdue at Purdue by 25. So, if Indiana can turn it into a bit of a scrap, can Iowa, sort of rise to meet a different kind of challenge? On the other hand, can Indiana handle what is bound to be a really boisterous environment in Iowa City? And for people who wonder, the return fixture in this is February 22nd in Bloomington. That's an 8 p.m. game. But we'll leave it there for now. For Mike Niziolek, Bloomington Herald Times, I'm Zach Osterman, the Indianapolis Star. This has been Mind Your Banners. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you soon.